Hi, my name is Shaimond Foy, and I'm here with my co-host Eva Potts, and this is episode 7 of the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. Today we have a special guest. Her name is Janet Duke, and she is a caregiver and family member of someone that has Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Actually, her mother has Charles Bonnet Syndrome, so she's going to share a little bit of her story and give a perspective from a caregiver and family member. So, hello, how's everyone doing today?
Hello.
Doing great, Shimon. Thank you.
So glad to have you both with us, and thank you for joining us, Janet.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. So, can you tell me a little bit about your journey with Charles Bonnet syndrome? Maybe a little bit about your mother and how she started losing her eyesight, and what the condition is that's causing her to lose her eyesight.
Sure. There is a genetic eye disease that runs in my family, retinitis pigmentosa. My grandmother had it, and my mother has it. And basically starts off with full vision and then they start losing vision over time. My grandmother became completely blind at a young age. Hers progressed pretty quickly once she became an adult. My mother started losing her sight when she was about 30, and right now she's in her 70s. And she basically has no vision now. She does occasionally report seeing some light sometimes. Before the pandemic started, she did have a little bit of vision in spots. She had some pinholes, is how she would describe it, where there was some vision. So if she scanned things using her eyes in bright light, she could still make out some things and still could get around and do some things. But during the pandemic, her eyesight went went bad very quickly, and that's when she started exhibiting symptoms of Charles Bonnet. Um, I live in another state from her, and so I did not and was not able to see her progression. From losing her sight so quickly during the pandemic because I could not go there, fly, and see her. So it was an interesting thing to happen because everything was via the phone. She does not know how to use the computer without being able to see. And my stepfather also had difficulty trying to do that because I also was hoping that maybe, via apps like Zoom or something, I could get a better idea of what was going on in the state of things. But they couldn't figure that out, and because of being isolated and my mother um, having an autoimmune disorder, not being able to have people around, and because of the pandemic, it was kind of a tough thing to try to figure out via the phone. But the way that it all kind of came about was, I should let you know, my mother is a retired nurse. She has a medical background, very smart individual, very sharp. Um, and I was talking to her on the phone one day, and she kind of just real casually said something about all of the plants in the bathroom growing too much, getting in the way. And I remember thinking that that was strange because my mother has never had houseplants from the time I was young because she said that she didn't have a green thumb and they would always die. And from the last time that I had been in her apartment, there were no plants, and especially not in the bathroom. So I remember thinking it was odd and saying to her, "You have plants in the bathroom?" And she was like, "Yeah, they just keep growing." And that, she has to keep pushing the, like moving or, like trying to navigate around them. And it's hard with her sight. Um, So I thought that was strange, and I said, "Well, move him out of the bathroom," and I just remember very vividly thinking that's very bizarre that she would say that. But in a later conversation, we were talking, and she she sounded agitated. And it's kind of funny when I reflect back on it now, but she was kind of seemed stressed and agitated. And, of course, everybody was at that time during the pandemic with everything going on. But she just kind of was like, oh, great. A cow just came into the living room. It's going to traipse in dirt all over the carpet. And I keep trying to keep this carpet clean. And she was kind of going off. And I was like, wait a minute. What did you say? A cow came in? She's like, yeah, a cow just came into the living room and it's bringing dirt all over the carpet. And, she went on to complain about trying to keep the carpet clean. And I remember like this sinking feeling in my like my stomach, my heart, because I thought, oh my God, is she having a stroke? What's happening? Because I mean, she lives in a suburb. There's no cows around. I mean, there's no way a cow could actually walk into the living room. And so I didn't know what was happening to her. So I started kind of trying to ask clarifying questions, and she was insistent on this. And I thought, okay, my mom's a smart woman. Clearly, there cannot be a cow in her living room. Something must be happening. And my stepfather was not around. And so I felt a little bit panicky like, do I need to call 911? Um, and I said, I was trying to reason with her, like, Mom, there's no way a cow can be in the living room. How would a cow get into the living room? And she very logically was like, well, it must have come through the sliding glass door. Like, like, of course it's there, must have come through. And she was very kind of focused on the dirt. Not that there was a cow in the living room, but that the dirt on the carpet. And so I remember just being like beside myself going, oh my gosh, what's happening? What do I do? I started kind of asking her questions to kind of be like, is she, like, Mom, do you know what today is? Like, what's the date? Like, just kind of asking those kind of questions like, is she in her right mind? And she could answer everything completely clear. And she was getting even more annoyed with me by my questions. So I knew she was in her, like right mind. She was completely, you know, everything that I was ask her, she was fine. She was just upset about this cow bringing in dirt into the carpet. Um, so at that point, I really just didn't know what to do. And honestly, I don't remember a lot because I think I was so much in shock. And so, like, I don't know, scared. I don't know what the right idea was, but maybe shocked. Like, what do I do? I didn't know what to do. Here we are, kind of in lockdown. I'm in another state. Clearly, there's no cow going into the living room. Can't get a hold of my stepfather's not there. What do I do? Um, but I can kind of share that there's bits and pieces in my memory of the following days and weeks, and unfortunately it went in ups and downs because sometimes when I talked to her, um she seemed to be of more a pleasant demeanor and not so agitated. And other times she was completely agitated and wouldn't let me get in a word because she was very, very upset. And so I can kind of share some of the experiences that I had, but before I kind of start going down that route of like the progression and some of the things, I want to share like what I did because I knew my mother was a smart person. She didn't have dementia. She was completely fine. There was, nothing that I could think of, that would cause her to be seeing cows coming into her living room. So I started Googling things. I got on my computer. I started, looking up all sorts of things of visual imageries, hallucinations, whatever, animals, retinitis pigmentosa, people losing sight, just all kinds of things. And I came across Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And when I started reading it, I thought, oh my gosh, this must be what is happening to her. Because as I started looking more online, and found YouTube things, found things on Facebook, and groups, and just all of these social media sites, sites that came up on Google, and reading and hearing about other people's experiences, and came across Dr. Dominic Fitch, and YouTube, and all of these things. I realized, and it gave me a sense of peace. Okay, this is what I'm dealing with. This has got to be what it is. I can identify it. I know she's not losing her mind. She's not having a stroke, whatever kind of ideas that I had before. I realized this is what is happening. But on the downside, there's not a lot of information out there about how to, like, there's no cure, so to speak, of it, for it. There's no, like, okay, if this is what it is, this is what you do. There was nothing like that. So even though I could say, okay, she's not crazy, this is what's happening, there was no kind of like, okay, so now this is what has to be done. And so I found myself, I found Dr. Gary Cusick's group, and I reached out and I got involved with that. And that was of a tremendous help to me, because then I was able to connect with other people that had Charles Bonnet, as well as caregivers of people with Charles Bonnet, and could share my story and relate to them and find out more about it and hear from other people and what their experiences were. And it helped me to realize, okay, I'm not alone with this. My mother's not alone with this, that there are other people out there. And some of the experiences are similar, and that was helpful for me. Unfortunately, it also was discouraging. So it was helpful and discouraging at the same time, because some of the people with Charles Bonnet that I met and talked to had had it for many, many years, and had found nothing really to make it go away. So then I knew, okay, what I was dealing with was probably not going to go away, and that there was no real consistent answer, I should say, on what can be done to help with it. So, gosh, I've been talking a lot. Do you have any questions so far?
No, no, this is great. This is a great, it kind of encompasses a lot of things. And this is probably something that happened over the course of a couple of months, right?
Oh,
All of the
yes.
information that you
Yes.
said. I do have
Yes.
a question. I know this was a long time ago, but if I was curious. You mentioned your mom said that there were plants in the bathroom,
Mm-hmm.
and then that there was a cow in the living room. Do you know how long in between both of those incidents? Was it like something that happened like relatively quickly, or was it a period of time where she was mentioning the plants and then the cow incident?
That's a great question. And I actually, after things settled down, I was able to kind of get from her more information about how and when she started kind of having I call them visual images. I don't like to use the word hallucinations, although I know a lot of people do, because the connotation it has with, maybe a psychosis, or hallucinogenic drugs or things like that. Because really what I have come to realize is that it's her brain kind of misfiring this visual imagery. There's nothing related to, auditory or hearing. Nobody says, there's no noise. There's nothing that, whereas like some people, if they're hallucinating, they hear people and see people talking to them or things like that. And nothing like that happens. It's just completely visual imagery. There's nothing tactile or feel, or you can't touch them, you can't hear them, you can't smell them. It's just strictly visual imagery. And when I talked with her, she did mention that she had started seeing some patterns on the floor and then on the walls. So, like plaid or checkers, or, different kinds of patterns she had started noticing in hindsight, by the time, and she didn't mention any of it to me. The first thing that made me realize that she was having any visual imagery was the plants. And what's kind of interesting is when I started researching Charles Bonnet syndrome, I realized that there are these kind of categories that people have that are common. And one of them is to see patterns. And that's, I think, how it kind of quote unquote started. Um, when I talked to her about this, when she had mentioned, and this is later, she had mentioned her retina specialist when she would go to see him, and this was, prior to the pandemic, that he had mentioned a couple of times asking her, have you started seeing any patterns or anything that is different from what you would normally say, like seeing things? And him asking her this when she would have checkups, and she would say no, and that he would say, sometimes for some people that might start happening. So that led me to believe that if he was asking her that, then he had an awareness of Charles Bonnet, or if it wasn't Charles Bonnet, he knew that some of his patients started seeing things. So that was interesting to me. And when I mentioned this to her later and said, can you please let him know that you did start seeing things? And she said that when she did schedule an appointment, she did tell him, and that I had mentioned, that maybe she had Charles Bonnet and all this stuff. And he was like, yeah, that's what it is. But kind of very like lackadaisical, I guess, about it. Like, yeah, it's got Charles Bonnet. And I was like, well, what did he say after that? And he was like, yeah, that's what it is, but there's nothing you can do about it. So that was it. So,
And therein lies the frustration.
right. So she was kind of like, okay, well, you're not telling me anything I already don't know. You had asked me this and this happened. My daughter's the one that told me that's what it is. And so I'm telling you what it is. And you're like, yeah, that's what it is. You know,
And then they drop the
and
ball and
and then that's it, because
yeah.
they don't know, there's nothing, I guess, out there to kind of say, okay, so now you've got this, these are some things that can help, these are some, experiences, these are people or support groups you can go to, this is, things that caregiver. There was no guidance, no information. It was just, yep, that's what you have, you can schedule your next appointment on your way out, have a nice day.
Yeah, good luck with all that,
Right.
right?
Good luck with all of that. Because
Mhm.
and I in some ways I get that, because, having some, background working in the medical field, if doctors aren't trained on something and know how to treat it, because that's their job, right, is to diagnose and treat it, then, that's okay, that's what you've got, the diagnostic, but there's no treatment for it. So, all right, there you
And
go.
this is where the medical field in general has failed individuals with Charles Bonnet syndrome because they're not teaching any coping mechanisms to go with the diagnosis. And yeah, the research is relatively new, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote new from Dominic Fitch, but it is out there. And it's whether or not these ophthalmologists, anyone who's working with low vision, onset blindness, anybody who works with people who have low vision, they're not continuing their homework and research on, okay, well, I've had one or two people with Charles Bonnet syndrome, let me look it up and see if there's anything that I can help them with,
Right.
and reach back out to them. I was speaking with a neurologist one day who actually was scratching his head saying, wow, excuse me, please. I wonder how many people I've had walk out of my office and I didn't I let them walk away thinking they had something else wrong with them. You
Mhm.
know, my mother was slapped with a dementia diagnosis, which she didn't have.
Mhm.
And and that's the problem that we're having as well. Thank goodness, you know, your mother could pass those assessments. My mother was given a dementia diagnosis without an assessment. And it's very frustrating when people in the medical community are not taking the time to even eliminate the other problems that could go on with the hallucinations, as you say. And I, as well, don't like the word hallucinations, but we're stuck with it because the World Health Organization decided to put that word in their ICD 11 diagnosis, which thank goodness we got that much.
Mhm.
It's recognized now by WHO, but it's not recognized yet fully in the United States for you go to a neuro-ophthalmologist, you're diagnosed, okay, here we go. This isn't going to take away your symptoms, but here are some treatment options. You know, people are going to cognitive behavioral therapy. There are those different coping mechanisms. But the problem is there's no research. Nobody's really digging in and researching this to figure out, okay, how can we help these people, except in the UK?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and unfortunately, my mother was diagnosed. Well, I don't know if they actually did the official diagnosis of being psychotic, and she was hospitalized,
Oh
and put
dear.
on antipsychotics. And the reason for that is because it made her, have what I would consider to be like a psychotic episode, because it got so bad that it started making her crazy. And so, because even though it started with patterns and then became plants, then became animals. Okay, so she started not only seeing like regular animals, like a dog, puppies, or she started seeing like mythical creatures. And one of them that started talking about was, I guess, what looked to be like a large stuffed caterpillar, but it was rainbow colored, and went across, and she would explain these creatures that were in her living room, and it was bizarre. It was just bizarre that her brain was creating these visual images that were so just kind of, like the creativity of it all, like, um it was just amazing when she would describe some of these things. Sometimes I wish that I would have recorded, or knew how to record some of these phone conversations so that I could remember all of it now, because she doesn't remember a lot of it. And I don't know whether that's because it's too upsetting, or, because right now she's on a lot of medication, and she was put on a lot of medication to try and stop the visual hallucinations, if you call it, or images, because it upsets her, because it went from the animals and the what I call mythical creatures to them becoming people. And that's when it started getting bad, because the people, she and this is still what is really strange to me about this syndrome, is that she would see these people in her living room, and she believed that they were really there. And she's a smart person, and she can be logical, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, Mom, you can't see, you have a hard time seeing, and yet you're seeing these people crystal clear that couldn't possibly be in your living room. And she was insistent that they were there, and I would continually try to argue with her. It's like, that's your brain creating visual images. And it I think it just upset her, and upset her brain, and tricked her, and all this kind of stuff, that she had a hard time differentiating what was real or not. And it doesn't make any sense now. She knows now, after she got put on this medication, and then all of that, that period or something ended. If she sees people, because she if they reduce her dosage, they come back. I call them the people. How are the people? Are the people there? Um, she um, she knows they're not real. She knows that it's her brain, the visual imagery. At this point, she can differentiate that, but it still upsets her, and she doesn't like it. She doesn't want the people to be around. And I guess I can understand that, because when it got so bad, and here's what's interesting too, and when I read and study up on Charles Bonnet, this also seems to be a pattern, is that people who do have the hallucinations of people, seeing actual people, the people that they see tend to be dressed in kind of uniforms or costumes, or things from certain time periods, and like usually have some sort of headgear or hats or things like that. That was always the case with the people. When I would ask her to describe the people that she was seeing, they would be, soldiers in uniform, construction workers, people from like the 20s. Like, when she would describe them to me, that's always would be kind of the case, which is very strange also. Like, if your brain's going to create these visual images, that it's not, people, people that you see around, people, as if it's creating these completely different people that you don't know, in costumes and uniforms and things. It's very bizarre. Um, and like the mythical creatures, she would describe some of these costumes, or whatever you would call them, the clothing and outfits or things, and it sounded fantastic. Sounded, like a costume design for a film. And clear as day, she would see these people. But where it became really problematic, and I do believe that stress and anxiety can play a part in the visual imagery. Like, it can make the brain misfire in a way that the images can be scary, and then that can ramp up more anxiety and stress, which can then, it's like a vicious cycle, make them even more scary. And because that's what I saw happening with my mom during that period, is that she was getting agitated about all of these animals and everything bringing in dirt and getting all over the carpet and stuff, and trying to deal with that. And it was in the COVID pandemic, and fear and anxiety from that, and lockdown, being isolated, all of these different things, watching the news, all of the stuff that was going on in the world. It just was ramping up her anxiety, her stress, not having social outlets, all of these things that, it created like this perfect storm, where it just made all of these things worse. And by them was making her worse, which was making that worse. And it became this vicious cycle, because the people started becoming scary. And that, for example, um, she would get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and there would be a man standing in the hallway. Now, I don't know about you, but that would scare me. If I went to get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and a man was standing between me and the bathroom in the hallway, a man that I don't know, that would be scary for me. I would fear for my safety. And those are the kinds of things that started happening. She was afraid to get undressed, to take a shower, because these people would be watching her. They're in the room, and then it got worse to where she believed that that she saw them stealing things from her. And and then it got to the point, which is where it really, as a caregiver, this is, of course, is very upsetting. You have this loved one that's experiencing all this. You can't do anything about it. Um, where it got really bad for me, in terms of me coping, was when she started calling the police. She started calling the police on the people that weren't there. And so what would happen is, for example, she saw construction workers coming into the apartment, and bringing in tools, and like they were going to tear down the wall. And she got upset. They were going to tear down the drywall or whatever. And I'm not there. I'm in a completely another state. I don't know what's happening. All I know is after the fact, when I would talk to them or my stepfather or police or whoever would be talking to, is she thought they were going to tear down the wall. She was telling them to go away. They weren't going away. She calls the police. When the police come out, of course, they see no construction workers there. She says, "Oh, they left." And then of course they tell my stepfather, you need to take her to the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
So then they take her to the emergency room, and my mother, being the smart person that she is, they ask her questions, and I wasn't there, but whatever results is, there's nothing wrong with her, and they send her home.
Right.
And it became this back and forth, this game. Police are called, police tell my stepfather, bring her to the emergency room, brings her to the emergency room says nothing wrong with her, send her home. And he was losing his mind trying to deal with it. I was losing my mind trying to deal with it. I didn't know what to do. And when I tried to talk logically to her, she would get so upset. And and then when it came to them stealing things and stuff, and in my mind, I knew that it was just the visual images, that it wasn't real. And yet couldn't seem to convince her of that at that point. I think she was just so out of her mind from dealing with it constantly that she could no longer like understand that it wasn't real, and was reacting, to her appropriately by yelling, telling them to get out, go away, and if they're not listening, calling the police on them.
Mm.
And I eventually wound up having to, and at this point, I still couldn't go there. The state was locked down. You couldn't fly in unless you showed all these things for COVID and stuff like that. There was all these restrictions. I couldn't go into the hospitals. I couldn't go into the doctor's offices. Even if I was able to physically get there, I would not be able to accompany her anywhere. I couldn't get HIPAA release. It was a perfect storm of a situation of on trying to how to deal with all of this. And so eventually, when I found out that she had picked up a baseball bat to try to hit the people to get them, to get out, and was then destroying things and accidentally hit my stepfather, that I realized that, okay, now she's hurting other people. That's when it's got to stop. And so I provided my stepfather, I said, obviously, when you're taking her to the emergency room, whatever is going on, she's saying whatever she needs to say to leave, because she's smart enough to know that if she says certain things, they're going to hospitalize her, and she doesn't want to be hospitalized. So you're going to have to be the one. You're going to have to stay in there, and you're going to have to tell exactly what's going on so that they'll listen. And I told him, what you have to say is that she's a danger to herself or to others, because at this point she is hitting you, right? And that's what finally made a difference, and that they didn't just turn her and send her back home. And, that's when psychiatrists got involved. But of course, the psychiatrist that I dealt with had no background knowledge or training of Charles Bonnet either. I had to be the ones to teach them, to send them information on it. And of course, you can find this stuff online now and everything. So that was helpful in my credibility, instead of just, saying this is what it is. And they're like, lady, you're crazy too. Um, so then they could, educate themselves as doctors on how to deal with it. But once again, there's really no, quote unquote treatment for it. And at that point, they put her on a antipsychotic drug, which of course then stopped the visual images because it just dulled your brain to such an extent that, if your brain's going to be misfiring, in that cortex or wherever it is because of, no longer having that sight there, or however the brain does this, it's going to dull it so much that it's not happening, and that's what happened. And she continues to be on the medication. They've greatly reduced it, so she's not drugged up all the time, but if they reduce it too much, then the quote unquote people return, and that upsets her and she doesn't like it, so she stays on the medication.
And I hear that a lot. And of course, that happened to my mother as well. What we found out with the course of treatment, they kept giving her antipsychotics, and all it really did, it worked for a little while, then it would fail. She became a really high fall risk. So, what we're hearing, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional. I have a background in psychology, but I'm not a medical doctor, not a psychiatrist. I always make that disclaimer. What we're hearing from people in our support groups and their caretakers, much like yourself, is that a lot of these antipsychotic drugs are given, yet at some point they begin to fail. But during the treatment, during the time that they're put on these antipsychotic meds, they become a really high fall risk. They're, like you said, dulled.
Oh,
The
for
brain is dulled.
sure she's a high fall
Yeah,
risk now. Yeah.
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 And do you mind if and you can share or not? Do you mind sharing which drug she's on? That,
Risperidone.
yep, that's what they gave my mother.
Yep.
And it actually, another thing we're finding through conversations, and this is just through the support group. This isn't anything medical data. Well, it is data, but it's not being recorded in the medical community at this time. People in our support group that have been put on the risperidol find that it led to different problems psychologically, that that was dulled for a while. And I just wonder, I know I digress here. It's almost like a double-edged sword. You give it to them because it helps to calm them. It alleviates the nightmarish visions that they're having, and you're relieved for them until it doesn't any longer. And they can either increase the dosage, and then you've got somebody you can't really. My mother was completely blind. I had to transfer her from the bed to the bathroom. And just like your mom, she gets in the bathroom, there's 5 or 12 people standing there. Who wants to go to the bathroom with 12 people staring at you?
Right.
And or to get her in the shower, really to get her to go anywhere, she would be excuse me, blocked by something or some type of vision. And even with this risperidol, it seemed to start to wear off. And I have to agree with you. It's almost as if we don't find a way to help people through this, if we don't find a way, and research isn't done to really help these individuals, it becomes a dangerous situation where we're giving them antipsychotic drugs for something that isn't a mental illness.
Right.
It's this physiological condition that the brain, the visual cortex, continues to fire these images. And it's a brain thing, and it's so frustrating. I guess where I'm trying to get to here is, at what point, do we start looking at this, and research is done, and the medical community starts to pay attention. If the numbers are correct, which in the UK they're finding that 1 out of every 3 people with low vision or onset blindness begin to develop Charles Bonnet syndrome. That's a lot of people in the United States. If we're looking at, the numbers are inaccurate because they're all based on surveys and what the medical community reports, but 37 million Americans that are legally blind. If we take 1 out of every 3 of those people, that's huge. And so you're talking about all these people who are suffering, that are probably going to lead them to another mental health condition.
Yep.
Anxiety, like you said, anxiety,
Yep.
um, PTSD
Mm-hmm.
from experiencing these frightening
Mm-hmm.
hallucinations. And so as a caretaker, I feel your pain, because it's like, okay, what's finally going to happen where my mother doesn't have to pop a pill to feel better. She's not feeling like herself because she has to take this antipsychotic medication. I mean, she's a nurse, for goodness
Mm-hmm.
sake. She knows what's going on. My mother was highly intelligent as well. She knew this isn't real, but wow, and so I tried to step in her shoes and say, okay, what if this was happening to me? And somebody was trying to convince me that that man's not standing in front of me in the hallway while I'm trying to go to the bathroom. And then you hope that the coping mechanisms will help. And you can just hear the frustration from you to me to where I'm sure Shaimond has some too, where you're wondering, how long is it going to take for a society that has so much advanced technology, that we're trying to find a cure for cancer, that we're working, we found something to help people with autism. This condition is 300, almost 300 years old, and we're no further along than they were in 1760.
Yeah.
Except for the development of resveratrol and antipsychotics, and but we're treating it as an orphan diagnosis when millions of people are suffering from it.
And honestly, I think a lot of it also has to do with that most of the sufferers are people that you would consider to be elderly or a lot older population. And
Mhm.
therefore, people, it's easier to say, oh, they've got dementia or Alzheimer's or there's something wrong with their brain or, that sort of thing. It wasn't
Mhm.
until I was in Gary Cusick's group that I learned that young people who are losing their sight also can get Charles Bonnet. And
Mhm.
that's actually, when you have a young person, that is experiencing these hallucinations or visual images, I think that's when people will be like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? Because all of those other things can't be potentially, tied into it. And, they're a lot of older people, they're not working, they're not, out in society interacting, having jobs,
Mhm.
all these sorts of things. So I think that's why it doesn't get maybe the attention that it should, because a lot of people that are losing their sight, it gets worse as you get older. But I did go to a and I can't think of off the top of my head what the organization was, but I went to a conference with my mom when I was a young adult in San Francisco, where it was for people who are blind or have a visual, you know, disease. And I remember going to a lot of the retinitis pigmentosa, research conference seminars and different things like that, because at that point I was really hoping that there would be some sort of cure found for it, so that my mother, could not could retain some of her sight and her lifestyle and so forth. And I remember meeting some people that were my age, which at that time was in my early 20s, at this conference, that had been losing their vision due to retinitis pigmentosa, and I had and it was a full spectrum, but there were some that had very little to no sight. And I can't help but wonder, are those people out there, those young adults that have Charles Bonnet? Because really, those people, I think, would be the ones that would be great spokespersons for this, for people to pay attention.
We actually have several people in our support group now, Janet, in their 20s, that that are reporting Charles Bonnet syndrome. And the unfortunate part is, we have dementia and Alzheimer's for the older people to slap them with that diagnosis. And then for the younger people, it's schizophrenia or some
Oh.
other type of mental illness. So instead of paying attention to Charles Bonnet and their low vision or onset blindness, we're finding that what reported that these individuals report that have been in our support group. We have one young man from Canada, and he reports that his parents were they were not supportive. And, his behavior was punished. Quit lying. Your imagination is so great.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of listening to the child, it was it was considered, oh, he's got a wild imagination. Oh, he's got a, no, that's just an imaginary friend. No, your kid's seeing somebody, all the way to, if you listen to our podcast with Jonathan Ward from the UK, actually, shocked to find out, he reported that as a child, he suffered from Charles Bonnet. On the other end of that spectrum, he had very supportive parents. His story is very moving.
Hmm.
And so you're talking about somebody who's now, I don't know how old Jonathan is. I'm not good at gauging people's ages by just by looking at them. But if you listen to that podcast, you'll find that his parents helped him cope. And, one of the things about being a caretaker is there's always that slippery slope of, do I try and be logical with them? You can't buy into the hallucinations. You can't buy into the visions, because that's not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And you try to be logical with them and say, all I can say is, Mom, because that was my experience. Mom, they're really not there. If they were there, I would tell you. I wouldn't want anything to hurt you. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't let anything happen to you. And do you think I'd really let this happen in your home or in my home? And, there's that very, very slippery slope of, what are they hearing all the time? Are they hearing that they're crazy?
Mm-hmm.
Are they being whispered in the ear, oh, you're crazy? That was being done to my mother once in a while from other family members. There was no compassion for what she was going through. And when that gets whispered in the ear of somebody who's dealing with this, it's not helpful from what we're learning, from what I learned on a personal level. And that's all I can really speak to, because again, I'm not a doctor. And I'm sure that, they hear that quite often. And so people tend not to report that they're going through. There are so many people who don't report this. We have someone in our support group, you may have met her, I don't know, and I can't really share her name, has had Charles Bonnet syndrome for 17 years, but did not report it to her own spouse for 5 years.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And because she was terrified of the stigma of being called mad, crazy, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's difficult for them as well. So you can only imagine a child fearful of what they're experiencing. And I know in the UK at one point, the youngest person they found that was experiencing or reporting those symptoms was 7 years old. I had a parent here in my area who reported that her child, she felt that this is what her child had, but could not find anybody to properly diagnose him, started at 7, and unfortunately could not handle the hallucinations, could not handle what happened to him. And he took his own life at 12.
Wow.
So, not paying attention to what's happening to these children is, in this day and age, once again, I have to go back to, with all the technology we have now, this diagnosis is out there. People are hearing about it. Well, then medical community, pay attention. Pay attention. Go back and learn about it. If you don't know what to do about it, how about starting some research? Mayo Clinic,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yale, Harvard. Let's go. All the big medical schools here. I challenge them to start doing something about this, because we have an entire population of individuals who are being ignored, mistreated, misdiagnosed. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing this, Shaimond and me, because, it's so frustrating to have all of these beautiful technologies at our disposal, all these intelligent minds, all these creative medical individuals who can find cures for other things. How about somebody pay attention to this and help us? And that's what we're looking for. This is why we're doing this. Bring education and awareness to the general public, the medical community, to please start paying attention to Charles Bonnet syndrome, because it's not just for the elderly. It is indiscriminate. It knows no age, no gender, no
Yeah,
ethnicity.
the only commonality is that you had sight and you start losing it. And I tell
Thank
people
you.
that I'm always educating people about it, and it always surprises me when somebody knows about it. And, and I'll say, oh, well, my mom has this thing called Charles Bonnet where she, oh, yeah, yeah, I saw something, every once in a while I'll run into somebody and I'll be like, oh, you know about it, And then, but of course, 95% of the time, I have to explain what it is and so forth and say, you can Google it, this is whatever. But it only happens in people that had sight and start to lose it, and it's something in the brain where you're no longer whatever seeing those things, it's doing misfires. I try to explain in basic layman terms as much as I can understand, to say that. But the fact that it doesn't happen in people that never had any sight, that right there, should be a clue for research, right? And
Mhm.
how this happens. um and even just the patterns are so interesting to me. The patterns, I mean, in what the visual images are,
Mhm.
is so interesting. How the commonalities and themes of these images is interesting to me.
I agree with you. And another thing that Dr. Cusick and Shimon and many of us have discussed is, I think that when research is really, and I'm really, ever hopeful that this we're going to hear about this one day and it's going to be recognized. I truly feel that at some level or at some point we're going to find that there's a spectrum based on personality type,
Mm,
lifestyle experience, life experience, and how those hallucinations or those visual um, episodes affect individuals, their severity of them, longevity of them, what type of experience they have. My mother would see writings on the wall. Now, my mother was an avid reader.
mm,
She, anything she could get her hands on to read. My mother was a writer. She wrote poetry. She's written 3 children's books that we're hoping to get published. She was just she thirst for knowledge. She read the dictionary, I don't know how many times, those big, thick Webster dictionaries. And she would see writing, and she also spoke Latin and she also spoke Greek. So sometimes the wording on her wall would be either in Greek or Latin. And I would always know she was so quiet, but I would see her staring up at the wall and going back and forth. And I'm like, Mom, she goes, shh, I'm reading.
mm-hmm,
So it's pleasant, but from memory, because my mother learned Greek. There wasn't Babel back then.
mm-hmm.
My mom had to learn Greek from Greek to English and English to Greek dictionary, right?
Right, right.
And from being connected to the Greek community. How ambitious is that?
Mm-hmm.
And was fluent in it. So it's there's so much that needs to be done. And you're right. I think that we're going to find so many correlations, but I think it's going to be so interesting to find out the comparisons of life events. So I don't know if your mother was, and your mother's much younger than my mother was, but my mother experienced World War II. So some of her hallucinations were the Nazi soldiers that she was fearful of. The blackouts in the city. She was from Jersey City, and they would have blackouts in the city. And so sometimes she felt she was just in blackout conditions.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it definitely has something to do with their life experiences for sure. I mean, it's not like she's going to see, things in Portuguese on the wall because she doesn't, know Portuguese, right? And
right.
my mother, was married or worked as a nurse in the military hospital. So seeing soldiers, around
Oh,
was not something that you would, find unusual. And she also did report patients. There would be patients on gurneys, patients, and people in patient gowns, all of this sort of thing. So it definitely draws, whatever that is in the brain, that prior knowledge or different things, it's drawing on that. It's not going to create something that is completely outside of somebody's experience, like totally.
I agree. And may I ask, and if you want to share, where is she now in her journey with Charles Bonnet syndrome?
So she when I ask her every once in a while, because she doesn't really bring it up or like to talk about it, she doesn't see the people, because she's on the risperidone. Um, However, as you mentioned, the risperidone has other nasty side effects, and she's been experiencing those some bad side effects from it. Besides being sleeping a lot of the time because she's drugged up, but she has some other medical issues. That I think are making all of this, compounded. And I mean, losing your sight is already something hard to try to manage and deal with, when you've been, had your sight for so long and an independent person, all these kind of things. And then suddenly, very quickly losing it all, along with medical conditions, along with this. She just doesn't have, to me, a very good quality of life, and she's dealing with a lot of bad side effects. And it's really, as a caregiver, it's really upsetting because, obviously, I would like for her to be off some of these medications and to be able to have a better quality of life, but she doesn't want the people to come back.
I understand that. And you when you say quality of life, they're the magic words right there, quality of life. And when people, I don't think there's ever a good time to lose your vision, just as you stated.
Right.
And it is such a significant loss. It's like anything that we lose of significance. And there's a grieving period. And we've talked about this on our podcast before, that it's not just, the person losing their vision. It's that mother you used to know that isn't there anymore, right?
Mhm.
It's that person that we knew that had sight. And as they lost their vision, they've turned into a different person. And then with Charles Bonnet, they almost become somebody you don't recognize, and you're more protective of them because you're so worried about what their brain is doing to them. And it is so frustrating as a caretaker to not have answers, to not know what to do. You feel so helpless. And that's why I'm always pleading with the meta. And when I finally realized, well, pleading and, shouting out into the universe isn't going to help me, I got to do something about it, which is the whole reason for the nonprofit that we're launching. I'm hoping and praying that it makes a difference eventually. And for this very reason, because of people like Janet, because of people like Shaimond, because of people who are suffering with Charles Bonnet, like my mother, because that quality of life, it doesn't just affect the person with Charles Bonnet, it trickles down to the caretaker, the family members, because you become enmeshed in what they're losing. And it is a huge fear factor, and we don't want to live with fear. We don't want fear to be part of anything that we deal with, but you can't help but be concerned about what's going to happen to your loved one. Okay, I'm going to give them the Risperidol, but look at what the Risperidol is doing to mom, right? But what's the alternative? Here we are without any of the answers. And I'm hoping that one person in the medical community is going to hear Janet talk, and they're going to say, wow, I need to do something to help Janet's mom. If nothing else, your story or other stories that people have told on our podcast ignite that passion in somebody to go do something about this.
Yeah, yeah, Janet, I'm curious, what advice would you give to other caregivers or family members of people that have Charles Bonnet that are listening?
Um, well, it did help me to go to the support group for, I did that for a while just to be able to talk to other people that are going through the same thing, to talk to other individuals suffering from Charles Bonnet, to learn their viewpoint, to help me understand my mom's experience, to read up on things, to do research, just to learn about it and things, and then it helped me to also talk about it and educate other people. Because I think talking about it and educating other people, in the hopes that maybe it makes a difference, but it also helps to, to put it out there and explain to other people, because it it's, I don't know, I don't know how to explain it, but to let people know that this is happening, and it affects me, it affects the caregiver as well, because as Eva said, the fear, the anxiety, the things that affect you as a caregiver, are real as well, especially if you are going to have to, there's the emotional part of knowing what they're going through and trying to, but there's also anxiety, a fear of how to help them, what to do with it. How is this going to affect your life? How are you going to pay for somebody to be there when this can't be done? They already can't see. You're dealing with somebody who's already having a hard time losing their sight, and the change in lifestyle and quality of life of somebody who can't do what they used to do, and that's already upsetting. But now dealing with this as well, and knowing that people might think that they're crazy, or that they don't want other people to know because they think they're all crazy, and there's nothing, just all of those sorts of things. Talk about it, learn about it, get support from others, and let other people know what's going on with you with it as well. Because even though it's not happening to me, it definitely affects me.
And that the other thing we're finding out about caregivers is the lack of sleep. And if the individual, well, I'll just speak from experience. I probably, the entire time my mother lived with me, and even when I would take care of her on weekends when she was in her own home, or when I would go take care of her, there was no rest, there was no sleep. And because she wasn't sleeping, or you would hear her start to stir and wonder, okay, is this getting ready to go into a full, full blown episode? And I did have in-home health care for a while. And I would think, oh, this is going to be my time to get some rest. But if the caretaker was having a hard time, or mom wanted me, I had to be front and center, because I wasn't going to not be present. That would throw her into another episode. So there's the lack of sleep. You're right. The emotional toll that it takes on a caregiver, it's a lot.
Yeah, my mom fired the in-home health care I hired.
Oh dear. Yeah. I've
Wow.
heard that a lot too.
And
Yeah.
honestly, I think it's out of fear, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if they don't understand, and that's the other thing. This is where all the training, it starts from the top down. And in-home healthcare, even police officers not knowing about what Charles Bonnet is, and
Mhm.
they're, of course, they're immediately going to go to psychosis. They're
Mhm.
not even going to consider Charles Bonnet syndrome, because they've been called to a location, they're not finding anything. My mother did that once or twice, and they get there and there's nothing there. Of course, they're going to revert to that. Police officers,
Mhm.
anybody in the emergency response community needs to be educated about Charles Bonnet syndrome, what it is. Oh, this could be what we're dealing with. Then they don't have to cart them to the hospital, because many people with Charles Bonnet syndrome, if they're taken by ambulance to a hospital, that short ambulance ride, or however long it is, can be just another stage for all this to be intensified.
Right.
And many people have ended up in a psychotic break by the time they get to that facility. And because they're so terrified, they're in a moving vehicle with somebody they don't know, they're being poked and prodded, they're, it's got to be the most frightening thing. And if they're blind, being blind alone is traumatic.
Right.
To be thrown into a situation where you don't know what's going on, you don't understand what's happening to you. And you're right. And let's even not even touch on our assisted living facilities that are probably packed with individuals that have Charles Bonnet syndrome, but they're given these really strong antipsychotics to knock them out,
Mhm.
because the staff won't deal, because they're not educated. They
Mhm.
don't know how to help them, so they knock them out. I know. I used to work in an assisted living facility. Now had I known what I know now, not that I think it could change a lot, but yeah, you put them into a psychiatric unit or into an assisted living facility, and they just knock them out,
Yeah.
never to be dealt with. And yeah, I'll get off my soapbox. Shimon, go ahead.
And there's no easy answers. There's no magic pill. Currently, there's no cure. So all of these things are frustrating, and it's like it'd be nice to tie this conversation up with a nice bow at the end and say, and you do this, you do A, B, and C, but it really isn't, and it's difficult. But by you, Janet, telling people that you see in your community or wherever you go about Charles Bonnet, and by you sharing your story here, because it is your mother's story, but it's your story too, because you're a family member and a caregiver. It really helps to bring awareness. And a lot of the things that you said are similar to my situation for my loved one that has Charles Bonnet, and for many others also. There are a lot of commonalities, and it just seems that your mother's case is a more severe case, and that tends to happen. So I'm glad that she's still taking it one day at a time. You are too. Hopefully, your stepfather is too. And just because it's the way it is today doesn't mean it's not going to get better tomorrow. And I just think that talking about it and supporting them the best way you can, maybe just listening, maybe you got to take a break, whatever the case may be, I think it can just be a helpful thing just to get the word out.
Well stated, Shimon.
But thank you so much for sharing the story. And is there anything else you would like to say in closing?
Gosh, no, it's just it's a lot. If people come across this, and hear this, I hopefully it can, I guess, ignite a passion to do something too. It is a difficult thing to think that there's all those people out there suffering and all of the loved ones that are suffering with them, and hopefully one day the somebody will find an answer to help with this.
You know what, Janet, I also want to give you a compliment because so many caregivers don't take the time or the energy to investigate instead of just, you know, um, flicking your mom off as, oh, she's okay, now she's lost her mind, she's crazy. Okay, we're gonna have to do something. Whether you actually took the time to figure out what was going on with your mom. And, a lot of times we don't get credit for being caregivers. It's not a field we're in to get any kind of recognition. We certainly aren't doing it for the glorification of being a caregiver, but we do it because we love the people that we love, because we want to be there for them. And so every time I talk to a caregiver, I just want to say thank you to them, because thank you for recognizing this, because each time a caregiver recognizes Charles Bonnet syndrome, there's one more person who's been validated in their journey with this, you know, and there's one more person who maybe we can help one day because we've given them that recognition that they're not crazy, that they've not gone mad. So thank you for being a vigilant caretaker.
Thank you very much.